The clock on the dashboard read 11:43 p.m. as Dr. Maya Thompson guided her silver Audi through the quiet streets of Cedar Grove. Her shoulders ached from standing over an operating table for 6 hours, performing emergency heart surgery on a teenage basketball player. The surgery had been successful, and now all she wanted was to get home to a warm shower and her husband's comforting presence. The autumn air was crisp and fallen leaves danced in her headlights as she drove through the upscale neighborhood where she'd lived for the past 5 years. Maya adjusted the heat, remembering how her mother had always told her to keep a blanket in the car during fall nights. The thought brought a tired smile to her face. Red and blue lights suddenly flooded her rearview mirror, shattering the peaceful moment. Maya checked her speed, 32 in a 35 zone. Her heart rate picked up slightly, but she remained calm, following the routine she'd practiced too many times before. Turn on interior lights, hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, registration and license ready on the dashboard. As she pulled over, Maya noticed how empty the stretch of road was. The streetlights cast long shadows across perfectly manicured lawns, and not a single house showed signs of life. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that she'd done nothing wrong. Her hospital ID badge was clearly visible on her white coat, and her credentials were impeccable. Officer David Reynolds approached her window, flashlight beam dancing across her face despite the well-lit interior. Maya squinted against the harsh light, but maintained her professional composure, the same steady demeanor that had served her well in countless high-pressure surgeries. "License and registration," he barked, without the customary greeting or explanation for the stop. Maya noticed his body camera's indicator light was off, and a knot formed in her stomach. She'd added her own cameras to her car after a similar stop last year, and now they were silently recording every moment. "Good evening, officer," she replied steadily, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed over years in the operating room. "My documents are on the dashboard. May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Reynolds ignored her question, snatching up her license. His flashlight beam lingered on her hospital ID, then swept across the interior of her luxury car. Maya recognized the look in his eyes. She'd seen it before, that mixture of suspicion and something darker, something that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with who she was and what she drove. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his tone shifting from harsh to dangerous. Maya's hand moved slightly toward her phone, where a safety app was already running, silently tracking her location. Her husband had insisted on installing it after hearing about her last encounter with law enforcement. "Officer Reynolds," she said calmly, reading his nameplate, "I've just finished a 6-hour emergency surgery and I'm heading home. If you could tell me why I've been pulled over, I'd be happy to." "I said step out of the vehicle." His voice rose sharply, hand moving to his holster in a gesture that sent ice through Maya's veins. "You people always think you're above the law, don't you? Driving around in cars like this, probably dealing drugs to afford it." Maya's fingers trembled slightly, but her voice remained steady. Years of handling life or death situations had taught her to keep her composure when fear threatened to take over. "Officer, I'm a cardiac surgeon at Cedar Grove Memorial. I've done nothing wrong, and I do not consent to leaving my vehicle without probable cause." Reynolds leaned closer to her window, his face contorted with anger. "A surgeon? Right, and I'm the president. Last chance. Get out of the car now, or things are gonna get real unpleasant." Maya's mind raced through her options. Her husband would be tracking her location, but she knew that every second mattered in situations like this. She thought of her patient, the teenage boy who'd be waking up tomorrow thanks to her steady hands. She thought of her parents, who'd taught her to stand up for herself while staying alive to fight another day. She thought of her husband, probably already mobilizing his team. The night air grew heavier with tension as Maya prepared for what would happen next, knowing this moment would change more lives than just her own. What Officer Reynolds couldn't see as he stood menacingly by Maya's car window was the quiet emergency unfolding on her phone. The safety app she'd activated was doing more than just tracking her location. It was sending a continuous live feed from her cast cameras to her husband's secure FBI server. Agent Michael Chen, Deputy Director of the Civil Rights Division, was about to show this small-town officer exactly what happened when you picked the wrong target. Maya's thoughts drifted to the day Michael had insisted on installing the cameras. "I've seen too many cases where it's just someone's word against an officer's," he'd said, his usually warm brown eyes haunted by cases he couldn't discuss. She'd agreed, thinking it was just his usual overprotectiveness. Now those hidden cameras were capturing every second of Reynolds' escalating aggression. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Reynolds growled, his flashlight beam still burning into Maya's eyes. "Get out of the vehicle, or I'll have to remove you myself." His free hand rested meaningfully on his handcuffs. Maya's medical training kicked in as she noticed her own symptoms of stress: elevated heart rate, shallow breathing, cold sweat on her palms. The same training helped her maintain her exterior calm. "Officer, I can see your nameplate clearly now. It's Officer David Reynolds, badge number 6472. I want to cooperate, but I need you to tell me why I've been pulled over." Reynolds' face twisted with rage at her careful notation of his details. "You think knowing my badge number's gonna help you? Nobody's gonna believe your word over mine, lady. This is my town." Maya's phone screen lit up silently. Michael had received her location. She knew he would already be coordinating with the local FBI field office. Her husband was a master of turning seemingly impossible situations into textbook examples of justice served. But right now, she had to keep herself safe until help arrived. "My dashcam is recording this interaction," Maya said steadily, deciding to reveal one of her cards. "As is my interior camera. Your body camera appears to be off, Officer Reynolds. Would you like to explain why?" Reynolds stepped back slightly, his confidence wavering for the first time. Maya could almost see the gears turning in his head as he reassessed the situation. His hand dropped from his handcuffs, but his expression grew darker. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" he snarled. "Recording devices can malfunction. Files can get corrupted. Accidents happen all the time in police custody." Maya's blood ran cold at the threat, but she kept her voice level. "My footage is being uploaded to a secure server in real time. Several people are watching this live, Officer Reynolds, including federal agents." She saw the exact moment doubt crept into his eyes. But like many bullies backed into a corner, Reynolds didn't back down, he escalated. He reached for his radio, probably to call for backup, not knowing he was only digging himself deeper into a hole that would soon swallow his entire career. In her rearview mirror, Maya spotted movement, headlights approaching fast but silent. Her years of marriage to a federal agent had taught her to recognize an FBI tactical approach. Michael's team was coming in dark and quiet, following protocol for corrupted law enforcement interventions. Reynolds was so focused on radioing for backup that he didn't notice the multiple vehicles smoothly surrounding them. Maya allowed herself a small breath of relief, but she knew the next few moments would be crucial. Her husband would handle this by the book, no special treatment, no hint of their personal connection. This wasn't just about her safety anymore. It was about building an airtight case against a corrupt officer. The night air crackled with tension as Maya watched unmarked vehicles take strategic positions around her car. Reynolds finally noticed the movement and spun around, his hand instinctively going to his weapon. Maya knew what would happen next. She'd seen Michael run similar operations before. Within seconds, Reynolds would find himself facing a team of federal agents, all of them recording every move he made. What Reynolds didn't know was that his traffic stop had just become the starting point of something much bigger. Maya's cameras hadn't just been recording tonight. They'd been gathering evidence for months, documenting every questionable stop, every instance of profiling. Her husband's team had been building a case, and Reynolds had just handed them the final piece they needed. The tables were about to turn in a way Officer Reynolds could never have imagined when he decided to harass a black woman in a luxury car. Maya took another steady breath, knowing she was no longer just a victim of harassment. She was about to become a key witness in a federal investigation that would shake this department to its core. More police cars were arriving now, local officers responding to Reynolds' earlier radio call. Maya watched their confusion as they took in the scene, their colleague in handcuffs, FBI agents documenting everything, and their usual power dynamic completely upended. One of the local officers, younger than Reynolds and visibly nervous, approached Michael. "Sir, what's going on here?" "Officer Reynolds is one of our senior officers." "Your department will be fully briefed tomorrow morning," Michael replied. For now, note that this is an ongoing federal investigation. We have evidence of multiple civil rights violations, and we're going to need full cooperation from your department. Maya could see the ripple of unease pass through the gathered local officers. Some looked angry, others worried, and a few, particularly the younger ones, seemed almost relieved. She recognized that look too. It was the same one she'd seen on nurses' faces when a problematic senior surgeon was finally called out for their behavior. As Reynolds was placed in one of the FBI vehicles, he shot Maya a look of pure hatred. But she held his gaze steadily, no longer afraid. The power he'd held over her just minutes ago had evaporated like dew in the morning sun. An agent approached her window with a card. "Dr. Thompson, this has the time and location for your statement tomorrow. We'll need all the footage from your vehicle's cameras." "They've already been uploaded to your secure server," Maya replied, allowing a small smile. "My husband insisted on a direct upload link months ago. Apparently, he's had some experience with evidence disappearing in cases like this." The night that had started with fear was ending with hope, not just for Maya, but for every person who'd ever been profiled or harassed by officers like Reynolds. As she finally pulled away from the scene, Maya caught a glimpse of Michael in her rearview mirror, already coordinating with his team. They both knew this was just the beginning of a much larger fight for justice. The FBI field office buzzed with activity as Maya sat in a conference room the next morning, her attorney beside her as she reviewed her statement. Through the glass walls, she could see teams of agents moving with purpose, carrying files and speaking in hushed tones. Her husband, Michael, was visible in his office down the hall, deep in conversation with his superior. "Dr. Thompson," Agent Lisa Park said, sliding a tablet across the table, "we've compiled footage from your car cameras over the past 3 months. Could you verify these incidents for us?" The young agent's eyes held a mix of professionalism and barely concealed anger at what she already seen. Maya nodded, taking the tablet. The screen showed a grid of video thumbnails, each one a different traffic stop. Some were brief, others prolonged, but all shared a common thread of harassment and profiling. She remembered each one, had filed them away in her mind like medical cases, each one building toward a diagnosis of systemic corruption. "This one," Maya said, tapping a video from 6 weeks ago. Officer Reynolds wasn't alone that night. There was another officer, newer to the force. He looked uncomfortable with the whole thing. She paused the footage at a clear shot of the younger officer's face. He tried to suggest they let me go, but Reynolds shut him down. Agent Park leaned forward, interest sparking in her eyes. "That could be important. We're building a picture of how deep this goes, who's actively involved, and who's been pressured to stay quiet." Maya's attorney, Mrs. Wom, a sharp-minded woman with 20 years of civil rights experience, spoke up. "My client has recordings of 17 separate incidents over the past year. In 15 of those, Officer Reynolds was either the primary officer or arrived as backup. That's not coincidence." The door opened and Michael stepped in, maintaining his professional distance. "Dr. Thompson, we've just received some interesting information from the police department's Internal Affairs Division. Apparently, there have been numerous complaints filed against Officer Reynolds over the years. They were all mysteriously dropped or buried." "Let me guess," Maya said, her doctor's instinct for patterns kicking in. "Most of those complaints came from people who look like me." Michael nodded grimly. "All but 2. And those 2 were from young Hispanic women. The pattern is clear, but it gets worse. We've found evidence that at least 3 senior officers were involved in suppressing these complaints. They created a system to protect officers like Reynolds." Maya felt a weight settling in her chest. "So it's not just one bad officer, it's a culture of corruption." "Exactly," Michael replied. "And that's why this case is so important. Your recordings don't just show Reynolds' actions, they show the broader pattern of behavior that the department has been denying for years." Mrs. Wom tapped her pen thoughtfully against her legal pad. "The real question is, are you ready for what comes next? Going public with this will make you a target. Not just from corrupt officers, but from people who don't want to believe this kind of thing happens in their town." Maya thought about her patients, about the trust they placed in her every day. She thought about her parents, who'd taught her that standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. "If I don't speak up, who will? How many people has Reynolds harassed who didn't have cameras in their car? Who didn't have an FBI agent for a husband? Through the glass walls, Maya watched as more agents arrived, carrying boxes of files from the police department. Each box potentially contained more stories like hers, more voices that had been silenced, more injustices swept under the rug. "There's something else," Michael said, sliding a folder across the table. "We've identified at least 7 cases where Reynolds and his associates falsified evidence. 2 people went to jail. We're already working to get their cases reopened." The weight in Maya's chest grew heavier. This wasn't just about traffic stops anymore. It was about lives destroyed, families torn apart, trust broken. Those people lost years of their lives because of this corruption. They lost their jobs, their homes, their freedom. Agent Park nodded solemnly. "That's why we're building this case so carefully. It's not just about punishing Reynolds, it's about exposing the whole system that protected him. But we need to do it right. No shortcuts, no mistakes they can use to discredit the investigation." Maya's phone buzzed, a text from the hospital. Another emergency surgery needed her attention. Life didn't stop just because she was in the middle of exposing police corruption. If anything, this case had shown her how many battles were being fought every day on so many different fronts. "I need to get to the hospital," she said, standing up. "But I want to be kept informed. And I want to help, not just with my own case, but with reaching out to other victims. They need to know they're not alone anymore." Michael nodded, still maintaining his professional demeanor, but Maya could see the pride in his eyes. "We'll need you to testify before a grand jury next week. Until then, be careful. Reynolds has friends, and they won't be happy about this investigation." As Maya gathered her things, Mrs. Wong spoke up again. "Remember, Doctor, you're not just a witness now. You're a symbol. People are going to look to you for strength, for hope. Are you ready for that responsibility?" Maya thought about the teenage basketball player she'd operated on just yesterday, about how every surgery was both a technical challenge and a human story. This case was no different. It was about following procedures meticulously while never forgetting the human lives at stake. "I'm ready," she said firmly, "because this isn't just about me anymore. It's about every person who's ever been afraid to drive through their own town. It's about making sure that badge means protection, not persecution." As she left the field office, Maya could feel the weight of what was coming. But she also felt something else, the same steady certainty that guided her hands in surgery. Some battles were worth fighting, no matter the cost, and this one had been a long time coming. The hospital cafeteria was unusually quiet when Maya walked in for her lunch break, 3 weeks after the traffic stop. Conversations stopped as she passed tables, replaced by meaningful looks and whispered comments. Her case had made the local news yesterday, and now everyone knew. Their respected cardiac surgeon was at the center of a federal investigation that was shaking the town to its core. Previous content continues as before. Maya smiled slightly, remembering something her mother always said: "Change doesn't come like a storm, it comes like a sunrise, slowly but unstoppably." The light was finally starting to shine on years of darkness, and no amount of resistance could stop the dawn. The federal courthouse steps were crowded with reporters and cameras on the morning of the grand jury hearing. Maya stood at the top, looking down at the scene, her testimony notes clutched in her hand. The past 2 months had revealed corruption far deeper than anyone had imagined, and today was about making sure justice would finally be served. "Ready?" Michael asked quietly, standing beside her in his official capacity. They'd barely seen each other these past weeks. He'd been working around the clock, building an airtight case while she balanced her hospital duties with preparation for this testimony. "I've testified in court before," Maya replied, smoothing her blazer. "Medical cases, expert witness stuff. This shouldn't be different." But they both knew it was. Medical testimony was about facts and procedures. This was about bringing down a system that had hurt countless people. Inside the courthouse, Maya passed by other witnesses waiting to testify. There was Mr. Chen, the restaurant owner whose security cameras had captured Reynolds harassing delivery drivers. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose teenage son had spent 6 months in jail on planted evidence before being cleared. Officer Taylor, the young cop who'd finally broken ranks to expose the department's cover-ups. They nodded to each other in silent support. Each of them carried pieces of the same story. A story of power abused and trust betrayed. Maya's testimony would help tie it all together, her car's footage providing irrefutable evidence of what so many had experienced. The grand jury room was smaller than she expected. 23 ordinary citizens sat ready to hear evidence that would shake their town's foundation. Maya took her seat, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth, though the real truth was bigger than any single testimony could convey. Dr. Thompson, the federal prosecutor, began, "Please tell us about the night of October 15th. Maya spoke clearly and confidently, just as she did when explaining complicated procedures to patients' families. She described Reynolds' escalating aggression, his threats, the fear she'd felt despite her professional standing. Her words painted a picture not just of one bad night, but of a systemic problem that had festered for years. The cameras in my car recorded everything, she explained, as footage played on screens around the room. But I want to be clear, I'm not here just because of what happened to me. I'm here because my cameras caught what hundreds of people in our community have experienced, people who didn't have the resources or platform to fight back." The questions continued for hours. Maya described other incidents, patterns she'd noticed, the growing file of evidence she'd collected. She talked about the people who'd reached out to her after the story broke, hospital staff, patients, strangers on the street, each with their own story of harassment and helplessness. During a break, Maya stepped into the hallway for water. She overheard two grand jurors talking quietly. "I never thought this happened in our town," one said. "We trusted these officers." The other replied, "Maybe that's why they got away with it for so long." Back inside, the testimony turned to the broader conspiracy. Maya's car footage had led investigators to uncover years of falsified reports, missing evidence, and coordinated harassment. The grand jury learned how senior officers had systematically buried complaints, protected abusive colleagues, and punished anyone who spoke up. Dr. Thompson, a grand juror, asked, "Weren't you afraid of retaliation when you decided to press charges?" Maya thought carefully before answering. "I was more afraid of staying silent. Every day at the hospital, I see people put their lives in my hands, trusting me to do what's right. How could I ask for that trust if I wasn't willing to stand up for what's right myself?" As she left the courthouse that evening, Maya found a crowd gathered on the steps. They weren't reporters this time. They were community members, holding candles in the growing darkness. Someone had organized a vigil for justice. Among them, Maya recognized faces from the hospital, from community meetings, from the growing movement for police accountability. There was the high school teacher who'd written to her, standing with a group of students. The nurse whose brother had been harassed, now helping others share their stories. "The grand jury will reach their decision soon," Michael said, joining her as she watched the vigil. "But whatever happens, things are already changing. 3 other departments in the state have started independent reviews. Police academies are updating their training. People are paying attention." Maya thought about Reynolds, now suspended and facing multiple charges. She thought about the officers who'd protected him, their careers and reputations in ruins. But mostly, she thought about the future. About young officers like Taylor, who'd chosen truth over loyalty to a corrupt system. Her phone buzzed with a message from the hospital. Another emergency surgery needed her attention. Life's rhythms continued. Hearts still needed mending, both literally and figuratively. As she headed to her car, people from the vigil called out words of support and thanks. "You know what this reminds me of?" Michael said, walking her to her car. "Remember what you always tell your residents before a difficult surgery. The hard way is usually the right way." Maya smiled, remembering countless hours in the operating room, teaching young doctors that there were no shortcuts to doing things right. The same principle applied here. Changing a broken system was hard, painful work, but it was necessary work. As she drove toward the hospital, Maya noticed something that brought tears to her eyes. Other cars were pulling over to let her pass, their drivers waving in support. The same roads where she'd once felt afraid now felt different. Not because the problems were all solved, there was still so much work to do, but because silence had been replaced with solidarity and fear with determination. The sun was setting as Maya parked at the hospital, casting long shadows across the lot where everything had started. But unlike that night 2 months ago, she wasn't alone anymore. None of them were. And that, she realized, was the first step toward real change. 6 months after the grand jury hearing, Maya stood at the podium in City Hall's main chamber, facing a room packed with community members and media. The indictments had come down hard. Officer Reynolds and 4 senior officers were facing federal charges, and the police department had been placed under external oversight. Change doesn't happen overnight, Maya began, her voice steady. But it does happen when people stand together. She was here to announce the launch of the Community Justice Foundation, created with her husband Michael to help victims of police misconduct fight back through legal channels. In the audience, she spotted familiar faces. Officer Taylor, now promoted to sergeant and helping lead department reforms. Mrs. Rodriguez, whose son's wrongful conviction had been overturned, now working as the foundation's community outreach coordinator. The high school teacher, whose students had followed the case, sitting with a new batch of teens interested in law and justice. The foundation will provide 3 main services, Maya continued. First, free dashboard cameras for community members who can't afford them. Second, legal support for victims of misconduct. And third, education programs to help people understand their rights and the proper procedures for filing complaints. The funding had come from unexpected places. Local business owners who'd stayed quiet for years out of fear. Wealthy patients Maya had treated who wanted to support her cause. Even some police officers who'd secretly disagreed with the old system but never had the power to change it. After the announcement, Maya headed to the hospital for her shift. The atmosphere there had changed too. Her stand against injustice had inspired others to speak up about problems in healthcare, racial disparities in treatment, unconscious bias in diagnosis, the subtle discriminations that could mean life or death. Dr. Thompson called out a young resident as Maya changed into her scrubs. Remember that training program you started for responding to prejudice in medical settings? The National Medical Board wants to implement it across all teaching hospitals. Maya smiled, remembering how the program had started, just a few informal discussions with residents who'd been inspired by her story to examine their own biases and assumptions. Now it was becoming part of standard medical education. Her phone buzzed with a text from Michael. Just finished training the new oversight committee. Real change happening. Also, dinner tonight. Their work schedules were still crazy, but they'd learned to find moments to connect, to remind themselves that they were partners in life, not just in fighting injustice. In her office between surgeries, Maya reviewed applications for the Foundation's first round of camera distributions. Each application told a story: the delivery driver tired of being pulled over for routine checks, the teenager afraid to drive to college classes, the grandmother who wanted to feel safe visiting her grandchildren across town. A knock at her door revealed Agent Park, now a regular visitor. "Thought you'd want to know," she said, settling into a chair. 2 more departments in neighboring counties have requested federal reviews of their practices. They're not waiting for complaints. They want to fix problems before they become scandals. Prevention is always better than treatment, Maya replied with a doctor's instinct. How's Officer Reynolds taking the plea deal? Agreed to testify against his superiors, Park said. His lawyer says he's finally understanding the damage he caused. Maybe too late for real redemption, but at least he's helping expose the whole system. Later that afternoon, Maya did her rounds, checking on patients. In one room, she found an elderly black man looking anxious before his surgery. "Doctor," he said, recognizing her, "my grandson showed me articles about what you did. Made me feel better about coming to this hospital. Knowing someone like you is in charge of my care." These moments kept happening, small reminders that standing up against injustice had ripple effects far beyond the original case. The Foundation was already handling dozens of cases, but more importantly, it was giving people hope that speaking up could actually lead to change. At the nurses' station, Maya overheard 2 officers chatting with the staff, part of the new community outreach program. Their badges now carried cameras that couldn't be turned off. Their training now included extensive modules on bias and proper procedure. Small changes, but important ones. That evening, driving home, Maya passed the spot where Reynolds had pulled her over. The city had installed a new streetlight there, one of many improvements suggested by the Community Safety Committee. The dark corner where she'd felt so vulnerable was now brightly lit, a symbol of how bringing problems into the light was the first step towards solving them. At home, she found Michael already there cooking dinner. "Rough day?" he asked, noticing her tired smile. "Good day," she corrected, saved 2 lives in surgery, helped 3 families through the foundation, and got word that our training program is going national. Not bad for a Thursday. They sat down to eat, discussing the day's events. The foundation's work was expanding, but so was awareness. People weren't just fighting individual cases anymore. They were working to change the system itself. It wasn't perfect, and there was still so much to do, but it was progress. "You know what someone called you today?" Michael said, grinning. "The surgeon who operates on hearts and the system." Maya laughed, but she understood the truth in it. Some problems required a scalpel's precision, others needed systematic reform, but all required courage to face and skill to fix. Whether in the operating room or the community, healing was about more than just treating symptoms. It was about curing the underlying disease. As they finished dinner, Maya's phone lit up with a news alert. Another department, another state, was implementing reforms based on their case. The change they'd started was spreading, growing, becoming a movement larger than any single story. "Ready for tomorrow?" Michael asked, knowing she had another community meeting scheduled. Maya nodded, thinking of all the people who'd stood with her, all the lives that were changing because one person decided to speak up, then another, then another. "Always ready," she said. "There's still work to do." The night was clear and calm outside their window, so different from that fateful evening 6 months ago. But the real difference wasn't in the weather or the lighting or even the policies. It was in the people who'd found their voices, their courage, their power to make change happen. One traffic stop had started it, but the community would finish it together.